obrigado por assistir a esse evento hoje presencialmente. Vamos gravar o evento também. Se vocês querem depois compartilhar o evento com outras pessoas, será um prazer de compartilhar esse link com vocês. Vou passar ao inglês, para nosso palestrante falar em inglês. Então, this is a pleasure to receive Professor Goran Dominioni, which is a specialist in shipping and governance. He is acting as a representative in the IMO, and he will give us a really interesting speech today of about 1 hour, something like that, and then we have time for questions and discussions with him. Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much to be here.
Thanks a lot, David. Thanks a lot, Jean-David, for the organizing this. It's really a pleasure to be here. I wish to come to Brazil various times in my life, so it's a pleasure, and say being able to talk about shipping decarbonization and what happens at the IMO with you, it's really a pleasure. So, as the title of the presentation, can you hear me well? Yeah? All right, good. What I'm trying to do today, if you want, is to a little bit give a bit of background, the policy context on what the IMO, let's say the context in which the IMO operates, if you want, in relation to shipping decarbonization, give a bit of an update on what has happened at the IMO so far, for those of you that perhaps don't follow the negotiations so closely, and then discuss some aspects related to the just and equitable transition of shipping. This is a very big topic. I'm going to touch upon some of the, some aspects that, without aiming to be comprehensive, but that perhaps are relevant for the further development of the work at the IMO. I'm open to take questions while I'm speaking, if you want, so that you make it more interactive, but otherwise there is going to be time also at the end. Hello, welcome. Background and policy context. Well, probably I don't need to tell you this. Shipping is about 2-3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and 80% of international traded goods, so it's a huge part of international trade. Some people tell me, why do you work on shipping? It's only 2-3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's small, yes, compared to other sectors, might be small. At the same time, it's more or less the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions of a country like Brazil or Germany. I found different statistics on Brazil, so I'm not sure which one is the one that is endorsed by the government, but so I said, so just to be sure. But it's similar to the one of Germany or Japan, so it's not that small. The IMO has been working on shipping decarbonization for over 20 years. For a long time, there was not a lot of things happening in terms of policy being adopted. Things have changed, I think, most rapidly in the last 5 years, and in particular from 2023 with the adoption of the 2023 IMO GHG strategy. I'm going to talk about it in a second. And this is just to say, for those of you that follow climate change but not necessarily shipping, is a separate process that goes along the one that is happening at UNFCCC, which cover most of the global greenhouse gas emissions. These are two separate processes. There are interactions between the two. Sometimes at the IMO, there are references made to what is happening at UNFCCC, but there is no, hierarchy between the two organizations. So the IMO doesn't have to follow what the UNFCCC does, even though the countries that are part of the two organizations are very much the same, mostly the same, and so there is some sort of coordination that happens informally, if you want. At the IMO GHG, so as I mentioned before, the main thing that happened recently, besides probably the recent approval of the IMO Net Zero Framework, was the adoption of the 2023 IMO GHG strategy. This is a resolution, so it's not a binding legal text, but nonetheless, it's a document that kind of gives a sense where countries kind of agree on kind of aims that they want to achieve and also on principles that they want to follow in achieving those aims in terms of decarbonization. It's a fairly long document, so I'm not going to give all the details, but just to give you a bit of context, The vision is to phase out greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping as soon as possible, and then to promote, and doing so while promoting a just and equitable transition, which is a bit the focus of my talk today. As you can imagine, the word just and equitable can be interpreted in many different ways, and whenever you talk with different delegations, they will have very different ideas of what that means. But just to give you a broad sense, just transition usually refers to maritime workforce. So, for instance, to the well-being, to diversifying the maritime workforce, and so on, while the equitable component is the one that refers mostly to, for instance, impacts on states, so distributive and procedural justice concerns relative to states, broadly speaking. But again, there are many different ideas on what that means. In a research we did with Beatriz Martinez-Romera from Copenhagen University, we tried to look at how these terms could be interpreted in light of the meaning that they have in the UNFCCC process. And it's sometimes simple to do so because there is, for instance, direct mentioning of the UNFCCC within the 2023 IMO GHG strategy in relation to some principles, but in others they don't. And so it's very unclear whether states, when they talk about, for instance, leaving no one behind, what they mean, whether they mean the same thing that they mean in the UNFCCC context or not. But anyway, so these are, if you want, political terms that allow everyone to say, yes, we agree, we want a just and equitable transition. And then everybody goes on. And then say the way in which the just and equitable transition takes place, then it's in the operationalization of the measures because they are undefined by themselves. In terms of levels of ambition, there are various. I'm trying to mention only the main one. Achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by or around, i.e. close to 2050. This is a funny language if you want, because by or around close to kind of it's a compromise between countries that wanted by 2050 and countries that wanted around 2050. And so they came out with this, which in essence reads as around 2050 because by or around means around 2050. And then there are indicative checkpoints for 2030 and 2040 with two levels, minus 20% over 2008 levels or 30%, so that would be the strive target, and then for the 2040 it's 70 to 80%. This is what it looks like if you want, assuming that it's by 2050, so these are the two green lines, is where shipping somehow should be based on the levels expressed in the 2023 strategy, and this is a business as usual scenario. So you see it's a steep decarbonization trajectory and a challenge certainly for the industry and also for the IMO. Since the adoption of the 2023 IMO GHG strategy, most of the negotiation focused on agreeing on measures that can drive the decarbonization of the sector, and so achieve the target and interim checkpoints. And there was an agreement that there would be a technical element in the form of the GHG fuel standard, an economic element based on a GHG emission pricing. And so since 2023, most of the large part of the negotiation focus on what these measures should look like. And the approval of the IMO Net Zero framework in April of this year is somehow a stepping stone towards this process. So, as I mentioned, there was approval at MEPC 83. Approval in this case means approval to circulate the text among member states, and then there is the formal adoption is expected to be in October of this year, at an extraordinary MPC, and then the entry into force will be in 2027. And it has been agreed that there will be, at least so far, it has been agreed that it should be an amendment to MARPOL Annex 6, and so the rules on the amendment of MARPOL Annex 6 will apply for the adoption in October. What is the IMO Net Zero framework? Very quickly, it's very broad when I'm trying to give you a sense. It applies to ships of 5,000 gross tonnage and above. There are some exceptions to that. For instance, semi-submersible vessels will not be part of the framework so far. The ships that are propelled with not by mechanical means will be exempted, so at least for the moment. And it's, in essence, as I mentioned before, the IMO was working on a GHG fuel standard and a GHG pricing mechanism. One of the main questions during negotiation whether this should be two separate elements or whether they should be combined in one element. And at the end of the day, the idea of merging them is the one that prevailed, and so that's what the IMO Net Zero framework looks like. It's a GHG fuel intensity standard. And you have two, metrics that are used to see whether vessels comply with this standard or not. You will have target GHG fuel intensity standards, which in essence is the average GHG fuel intensity of a ship in 2008, which is decreased by a Z factor, which becomes more stringent over time, so that gives you this trajectory. And then ships, basically, you look at the GHG fuel intensity of a ship within a year, and then you compare the attained GFI with the target GFI to see whether there is compliance. This is what it looks like, what has been agreed. You have, at the beginning, you have two GFI targets. So you have the base target, which is the one in orange, and the direct compliance one. The direct compliance, it will be most stringent. As you can see, there is, the Z factor, the reduction factor, there is 4%, then it becomes 30% in 2035, and then it's been agreed that it should be a reduction of 75% by 2040, but all that is in between is not really been agreed. So there are part of the GFI trajectory that are still to be decided. And in essence, with the way in which it works is that if your vessel is in this area, so it doesn't meet the base target, what they can do, they can either buy surplus units that are produced by direct compliant vessels. They can buy remedial units by an IMO Net Zero fund, and they pay the price for that is $380 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions, which in essence sets a cap to the price that will be paid for the surplus units produced by direct compliance vessels. If you are here, if your vessel is in between the direct and the base compliance targets, the only way you can kind of meet the target GFI is by buying remedial units from the IMO GHG fund, Net Zero fund, and that the price would be $100 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. If you are a fiscal policy person like me, that's pretty cool. It looks like the first global carbon tax in the world. It's not really a carbon tax. People don't want to call it carbon tax. It's not a levy, but it looks very much like one. So to me, it's pretty cool because it's the first time that you have an instrument that raises money at the global level and you have a global decision by the global community on how to use that money. And to me, that's pretty cool because in a time where there are a lot of division, geopolitical, struggles, that's something that it's a step in a very different direction, if you want. And then if your vessel is down here, so it meets the direct compliance target, it produces surplus units that can be sold to those that don't meet the base target. And some of the, technologies that are will be used to meet the direct compliance target may also be eligible for a reward, and we call them Z and Z, zero and near zero technologies. So this is to give you a sense of what has been, what the IMO Net Zero fund looks like. Now the IMO Net Zero framework looks like. And as you mentioned before, there are various sources of revenues that will go into the IMO Net Zero fund. These are the units that will be bought from vessels by vessels that do not meet the different targets. And is expected to raise, there are different estimates out there now, take them with a grain of salt in the sense that these are all projections and it's not always very clear how they're being calculated, but it will be about 10 to 15 billion US dollars per year. May not sound like a lot. It's less than others some countries have hoped. It's more than some countries have hoped, so it's somewhere in between what different member states wanted. But at the same time, if you compare it to the amount of money that big climate funds manage nowadays under the UNFCCC framework, like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, that it's actually quite big. It's larger than what most of the climate funds under the UNFCCC manage. So it's not a small amount of money. If you look at the way in which the net zero framework highlights some ways in which the money would be used that I think can be somehow distinguished in three main categories. One, there would be a reward for vessels that use Z and Z, zero and near zero technologies. It's not very clear what the zero and near zero technology is now. It's something to be defined by the IMO. And so it's also, and the amount of the reward is not set. So what is the amount of money that will go into that is not clear at the moment. It will cover the administrative costs for the functioning of the fund. What is that? What is that amount? We don't know. It depends how it will be structured, whether it takes the form of financial intermediary fund, whether it's a trust fund or something else. The amount of money that you need to run that facility probably differ. But it's probably not going to be a huge amount compared to what has been raised. And then there is the other part, if you want, which covers, there is a list of uses of the money, and I'm going to get into that in a second. If you're interested in looking at the revenue distribution component, I prepared the working paper that is available online, and I go a bit into the details of the also the legal terms of what has been decided and not been decided in that respect. All right, and so this brings me to some of the, if you want, the equity considerations related to this. So far I just tried to give you a sense of what was decided in case you're not familiar, you don't follow closely the negotiations. Now, and say the 3 points I would like to highlight, and I know some of them are controversial, and I'm looking there. It's distributive aspects related to the revenues. One aspect related to procedural justice on the way the governance of the fund, and the other one, it's related to policy overlaps that may occur within the, say, IMO Net Zero Fund and other, IMO Net Zero Framework and other policies that are being implemented at the subglobal level in different parts of the world. Starting from the first, now one of the most contentious aspects of the negotiations was whether the money, no, before I say that, let me say something else. That the money that will be going into what I call the other category is the only one where there is some level of differentiation between countries. So if you're familiar with the UNFCCC framework, usually there is the CBDRC principle, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle. That means that in essence, countries that have contributed less to climate change and have less resources to address it need to have some sort of favorable treatment compared to others. And so this is usually traditionally been seen as a distinction between the developed and developing countries. There was a list of countries in the old international treaties like the Kyoto Protocol and so on. Now it's a bit more fuzzy. People just say developed and developing countries, and this is something that is also happening within the IMO. This pot of money, not that one, this, but that also because it doesn't really matter, but this one is the only one where the specific is mentioned that it will be used having particular attention to the needs of developing countries. So if you look at it from a just and equitable transition standpoint and from the standpoint of differentiation between developed and developing country, a large part of that is probably being played out here in this context. Also because there are no exemptions in the IMO Net Zero framework, it applies equally to everyone. And so that's actually quite important for the differentiation between countries, if that's an element that you want to be part of the framework. Just to mention that. But the point I wanted to make is more about this part. So one of the key questions, one of the big fights within the negotiation was whether the money should be used only within the shipping sector, however it is defined, or whether some part of the money could be used also beyond the shipping sector. And different countries have different ideas on what that look like. I see you laughing. Some countries, for instance, were hoping to use some part of the money to go into, for instance, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, or another fund, and use it, for instance, for adaptation, mitigation. Less talked explicitly, it's also the Loss and Damage Fund. But let's say that remained a bit in the background if you want. At the end, this, and in a report we published with the World Bank in 2023, we made the argument that using some money outside of shipping would have been important to allow some of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change and probably will be affected the most by the implementation of GHG policies within the IMO to access some of the money. And so some of these countries, for instance, have a large fleet, very few ports, have very little capacity also to access funds in general when you look at their experience under the UNFCCC. And so expanding the use of money beyond shipping would have been a way to allow some of these countries to receive some of the money, and that you could see that as somehow as either a compensation for the potential harm that the implementing the GHG policies would have caused them. But they say this was not taken up. It's included in the language now, the IMO Net Zero framework, that the money in the other categories will be used within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping. And then there is a list of potential uses. So that point, to say if you want, was not taken up. There are lists of uses. I'm not going to talk about all of them. There are, despite the language within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping can be interpreted also looking at with the language of the potential uses. And so, for instance, there is explicitly mentioned that you could use some of this money to support marine coastal infrastructure. So it's not really shipping itself. You could have also money going onto land-based projects that are somehow related to the energy transition of shipping. And that actually makes a lot of sense if you think about the energy production that is needed for fuel the transition, if you want. So that makes a lot of sense. There is also, let's say, the idea that some of this money will be used to address disproportionately negative impacts on states. This has been one of the most contentious points in the negotiations, is the fear that some countries have related to the impact that GHG policies on shipping will have, for instance, on their GDP, on their import-export opportunities, and more recently also especially food security. Food security became a big thing in the negotiation in the last 2 years. There have been a lot of studies done on that. The IMO also made it was a comprehensive impact assessment that was led by UNCTAD and so on. And also I just wanted to highlight a paper by Jean-David on this topic, the most recent one. In essence, now there are different results, but if you want, now correct me on that, but the overall result is there will be impacts, mostly negative. Are they large impacts or small impacts? You can have different ideas on that. In the long term, we are talking still about 0.0% of GDP in most cases, but the impacts will be different for countries. So on average, they will be relatively small, but some countries will be impacted more than others. And I think there is a more or less a sense that countries, for instance, in certain part of Africa, especially central and the southern part of sub-Saharan Africa, will be impacted more. Small island developing states may be impacted more. And some countries also in Latin America will be impacted more. And so that raises issue of how do you address them, how do you address these impacts, how do you make this, let's say, a just transition accounting for these negative impacts that you could have. One thing I want to stress is that the language disproportionately negative impacts is not defined very clearly. It's not clear what the disproportionate impact is. Again, I think it's some of the language that you use in the negotiations say, oh yeah, of course, disproportionate negative impacts will be addressed, but what is a disproportionate impact? It's something that then it boils down to the way in which you design the measures and the way in which you construct the IMO Net Zero Fund that defines what the disproportionate negative impact is, because the criteria that you use to distribute the money, if they account for that, will be the one that actually operationalize what the disproportionate impact is. So as I mentioned before, in the last few rounds of negotiations, especially from the point of especially some African countries, Egypt was particularly vocal on this, made the point that one of the potential negative impacts of shipping decarbonization policies that needs to be addressed is food security. And so actually, if you look at the language of the IMO Net Zero framework, food security is the only type of negative impact that is explicitly mentioned in the IMO Net Zero framework. So that gives you a sense of the relevance that this had in the negotiations. One aspect, if you want, that I a bit struggle with, and so something I highlight in this recent working paper, is the difficulty that you may have in staying within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping and having an effective, cost-effective way of addressing potential food insecurity risks. In the sense that food insecurity is something that has usually compound causes. It's related to climate change, related to storage capacity, it's related to transport costs, it is related to trade policies. So there are many different causes of food insecurity. Now, assuming that, and again, this is still somewhat if, because there are not many studies on food insecurity and the IMO and IMO GHG policies, but assuming that there is a negative impact on food security, now using money within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping may not be always the best way to address food insecurity risks. So imagine, for instance, one way you could do that is, for instance, by, let's say that there are risks related to you don't have sufficient storage capacity for addressing food insecurity, or you need to have, or you are facing some climate change related disruption of your food production. Now, using money within the energy transition of shipping may not be the best way to address these problems. For instance, even though there are ways to do it, like for instance, you could improve port efficiency and so on, and that can help, speeding up the delivery of food. But nonetheless, I find that it's a little bit difficult to bring the two things together. And so for this reason, I think that perhaps a broad interpretation of what counts as within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping might be a better way to address some of the main concerns that the countries have expressed, assuming that these effects actually exist. And in this respect, it's also, I want to stress that when you say addressing impacts on states, it's unclear whether you want to mitigate them ex ante, so avoid them, or whether you want to somehow compensate for that. And so depending on the two, it is not defined in the regulations, in the IMO Net Zero framework. And so perhaps also the approach that you take in that respect defines how effective you are able to define this. And I would also say that this broad interpretation of of including aspects that are not necessarily related to addressing pollution from ships into the IMO Net Zero framework, in my view, would be compatible with MARPOL. I know there are different ideas on that, because MARPOL is a convention that deals with pollution from ships, and so there has been voices saying, well, if it doesn't address pollution from ships, it shouldn't be part of the IMO of MARPOL. If you read MARPOL, there are a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of exceptions in MARPOL, and there are a lot of different interests that are actually represented in MARPOL. For instance, the most obvious one is exemptions for vessels that are war vessels, or there are exemptions related to, for instance, the safety of the crew. So, for instance, some pollution regulation can be, you can disregard some pollution prevention regulation if this endangers the safety of the crew. And so there are different interests actually that are represented in MARPOL, even though MARPOL is a convention of pollution prevention. So similarly, I think a broad interpretation that kind of says, okay, there are exceptions. We want to use most of the money within the boundary of the energy transition of shipping, but we interpret this in a broad way so that we are able to address effectively also other type of risks wouldn't be necessarily incompatible, okay? Happy to hear differing opinion on this, but second point is on procedural justice. Now, the governance structure of the IMO Net Zero Fund, which, as I mentioned before, is going to be crucial for the way in which the money will be spent, is really not defined in the IMO Net Zero framework. It only states that it shall have a gender balance and a geographically balanced composition. This is fairly standard language for UN funds, same type of language you find it in the GCF and so on. One thing that I would like to stress here, and that it's a point that we made in another World Bank report in 2022, is that there is a fundamental difference between what now is going to be called IMO Net Zero Fund and UNFCCC funds. In the UNFCCC funds, the usual model is you have countries that put money into the fund. These are the donor countries, or sometimes, and then you have recipient countries. And so there's usually the distinction between developed and developing countries, right? They're called differently in different funds. Sometimes they're called recipient and non-recipient. Sometimes they're called donor countries and non-donor countries, and so on and so forth. And what happens in that context is that usually the donor country, the one that puts the money into the fund, wants to have some level of control on how to use the money. Because they say, well, I put the money in it, I want to control it. Now, this type of dynamic doesn't exist in the IMO Net Zero Fund, because there is not really a donor country or recipient country. There are vessels that pay the remedial units into the IMO Net Zero Fund, and it's not necessarily so obvious who is actually paying that, because vessels are complex entities. You will have the ship owner, you have the charterer, you have the one that orders the goods, the one that sends the goods, and how the cost of the remedial unit will be distributed along the supply chain will actually be not always easy to detect, and may change actually according to market condition by what we know. And so in some way, not having this dichotomy that exists in all other funds, I think that it's a good argument to have a broader representation from the developing countries, because in here you don't have the donor country that says, look, I'm giving money, I want to control it. You see something similar, if you want, in the adaptation fund, which is the only fund that is, at least until 2 years ago, was partially funded through a direct payment mechanism under the CDM, but we don't need to go into the details of that, but it's somehow a share of proceeds from the clean development mechanism. And so also there you see that almost 70% of the seats in the board of the adaptation fund are from developing countries. I think here could be even more, potentially, given that there is no really, say, donor-recipient dynamics. And so this is, say, the point that I wanted to make about procedural justice, looking forward for the development of the IMO Net Zero Fund. And that brings me to the third point, distributive aspects of policy overlap. If this is from my LinkedIn account in the last 2 weeks, a lot of people talking about what the EU is going to do now if the IMO Net Zero framework is adopted in October. Are they going to change their policies? As you probably are aware of, the EU has implemented various policies to decarbonize international shipping. One is the extension of the EU ETS to international shipping. The other is Fuel EU Maritime. And the EU is expected to review the climate policies, these climate policies in 2027 based on what the IMO has done and based on what other countries have done. And so in the review could take different forms. It could say, well, look, we're going to actually withdraw from the application of the ETS from shipping. They could also extend it, because now shipping applies only, so the ETS applies only to 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions released on voyages from to the EU. So that could be extended to over the 50% cover, for instance, to 100%. And so there are a lot of discussions on what should be done, what should not be done. So with Christian Petit, my colleague here, we wrote a paper together where we tried to look into this. We published this before the IMO Net Zero framework was adopted, so we don't really go into so it was approved, sorry. We don't really go into the comparison of the two frameworks or coming up with an idea of what could be done. But in essence, we try to map the pros and cons of different options. And in some way, there are different, There are different aspects probably that can be taken into account. From a climate change mitigation perspective, of course, it's better to have multiple policies to become more stringent. But of course, that could also result in negative impacts on states, as you have multiple, for instance, pricing mechanisms applying to the same ton of greenhouse gas emissions. And the compliance cost, of course, is one of the major. Now you see here concerns about compliance costs. And then there are also fiscal aspects to the extent that the two mechanisms raise revenues. Now the EU decides how to use the revenues. In the IMO context, you will have say, a board somehow composed that, however, represents a broader set of countries and so potentially a broader set of interests. Now, in the paper, we somehow try to indicate potential ways to address these issues. One would be, for sure, regulatory alignment, so the way, for instance, the reporting for GHG emissions under the EU MRV and the IMO are not fully aligned, especially for methane. And so alignment between the two regimes could reduce, for instance, some of the compliance costs, and that could also reduce impacts potentially on states. And that's probably something that I would say it's for the EU to align with the IMO than vice versa, simply because of the global regulatory regime that you have at the IMO. And the second point we make is that there is a lot of knowledge that has been created in a different policy context. The policy context related to CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but in essence, it's you can think in a simple way, it's a charge applied on imported products to the EU based on the GHG emissions that are released in producing those goods. So if you produce steel in India or in Brazil and you export it to the EU will try to estimate how much greenhouse gas emission have been produced in producing that steel, and they will charge a price based on the price that they apply to their own steel internally. And so it somehow tries to avoid the competitive disadvantage for EU companies, all right? Or to steel produced within the EU. Now, in that context, there has been a lot, and the EU has been working on this for 10 years. The US has been thinking about it for even longer. But since the EU has adopted CBAM as part of the Fit for 55 package in 2023, there has been a lot of research done by, for instance, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, academics around the world on how to compare different policies. And the comparison is particularly important because in the CBAM context, because when you apply a price on the imported product, you rebate the cost that has already been faced by the product in its own jurisdiction. So for instance, if Brazil applies a $10 GHG price per ton of greenhouse gas emissions released in producing steel, and the EU applies $50 per ton of GHG, they will rebate the 10% that has already been paid in the, yeah. No, please, yeah.
Just to understand, we have today few EU and ETS, this is focused on Europe, and you have IMO that will be
the global one.
Global, and few EU is in force now.
Yeah.
And IMO will be only in force as from 1st January 2020. This proposal is to make the both working in parallel. IMO not to be substituting the few EU.
No. So we don't get into what should be done. Also because we did this analysis before the IMO decided what to do, so that we couldn't even compare what the EU is doing with what the IMO is doing. What we look in there is to say if the EU decides to keep its own thing, and there are concerns related to the applying twice the same price to the same ton of greenhouse gas emissions, our idea is to, well, look, then you could have a rebate. So for instance, if the EU policies are more stringent than the IMO, then you could rebate some of the costs that are faced by vessels into the IMO, under the IMO framework when paying the price in the EU policies. And it's not a straightforward thing to do, simply because the EU ETS is fairly straightforward as a policy. You emit X, you pay X, Under the IMO Net Zero framework, it's kind of complicated because the best performing vessels, which are potentially the ones that get the rebate, are the ones that don't pay. So it's difficult, it's not so easy to compare the two. And so the idea there is a simple suggestion to say, look, there is a lot of knowledge that has been developed in another context for another policy. And now CBAM, I'm not sure whether Brazil is planning to do one. I know there are various countries that after the EU have started, has implemented its own, started developing their own CBAM. So for instance, Thailand is doing it, Vietnam is doing it, Turkey is doing it. And so in doing that, you always have to think, how do I compare my GHG policy to the GHG policy of the other country? So there is a lot of knowledge that goes into that, and that could be used in the context of the shipping decarbonization, not only by the EU, but also by other countries if they decide to come up with something by their own, or for the further development of the IMO Net Zero framework. So the parts that have not been, so for instance, the GFI trajectory and so on and so forth. So if you want to say, so for instance, you could use this knowledge to say, I want to come up with a policy that somehow will be recognized in a certain way to avoid policy fragmentation globally. And so we can have a discussion that is informed by what has been actually produced in another context to have an informed discussion. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think it's different to compare both systems. I think sorry, if I say any stupid things, but I see a different approach on both policies. Europe is much beyond the rest of the world because it was the first one to really organize, and it's good because when they organize, they can see now the impacts.
Yeah.
And in some way, both systems, IMO and Europe, ETS is not as relevant than fuel EU.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave different treatments to fuels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't see both as comparable that you can bridge. Because it's not, if they use the same standards of reduction and treatment for fuels, this could be, you could make a bridge. But for example, the fuel Europe gives a special treatment more beneficial to LNG than IMO.
Yeah.
So if you keep both running, you are going to give incentive to LNG that I think even Europe is not seen as beneficial. So I would need to study more, but I cannot see a comparison and both systems working together without creating an asymmetry in the shipping worldwide.
Sure.
Because in this case, the companies running LNG under the European regulation would be much more benefited than the IMO.
No, I fully agree. So again, the point here is not that the EU should keep those. I'm saying if they decide to do it for whatever reason, then you could think of having some level of, say, accounting for what has been done under a regime to be accounted under the other, to avoid somehow double application of the same to the same ton of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you decide to go that way, again, not making any normative point there, the suggestion would be to look at this, what has been done under CBAM. Various countries now will have a lot of knowledge on how to compare policies, partially because of that, because of this different policy. And so to use that knowledge to make this comparison, because as you say, it's very complicated. They are not comparable. It's one thing is to say I pay 10 and I pay 50, and then you just discount the 10 from the 50. When you have complicated regulatory frameworks like the one that we have here, you need to have some, say, level of, I think, thinking into to do it in a way that makes sense. And the reason why we say look into CBAM is that CBAMs usually are policies that are not implemented by the transport or the defense departments. So people working on shipping decarbonization are not necessarily the one that look into CBAM. In the EU, there are different DGs that look into it, and say could be, for instance, transport ministry that looks into shipping decarbonization in some countries, or the defense, depend on the country. CBAM is usually trade or climate people. And so it would be good to create regulatory spaces for a discussion, both within the country, but also between countries, if you want, where you bring people that have expertise that have been working on this comparison for many years and say, look, is there a way in which we could make sense within the shipping sector? So that's our suggestion there. Again, this is something that we wrote before the IMO Net Zero framework was approved. So it's not a direct comparison. Back then, when we published it, there was still, the different proposal on the floor. It was unclear where that was going. And because, I say, there is also a lot of knowledge in the OECD, the World Bank and IMF have done a lot of work on comparing different policies. And so somehow, if you want, there is support that could come also from multilateral organization on how to do so. Yeah, so and this brings us to the end. If you want it's a bit, say, the IMO Net Zero framework, I've seen various analyses out there. I'm sure there will be others that have been done or will be done on which type of fuels will be incentivized and so on. I don't express myself too much on that. I've seen different results, and some of these analyses are not very clear how they've been, say, made, because they come from consulting companies, just give you like this is what and then you don't know exactly how they did that. But so there is a lot to be decided still. A lot of the aspects of the framework that relate to the just and equitable transition remains to be defined. And again, my point was on the beyond, this meaning of beyond the energy transition of shipping, that in my view could be interpreted in a broad way to account for some impacts that otherwise would not be easily or cost effectively addressed. And the other point was on the governance of the IMO Net Zero Fund, where I think there is space, there are reasons to be made for having a greater representation of developing countries in the board. The board is the one that approves the project, so it's pretty important. And then I think there would be a lot of, say, issues on related, a lot of work that needs to be done into, for instance, how to avoid multiple, the negative effects of multiple GHG policies. Our paper was the first attempt to do so, but there is certainly more that can be done now that some of the details have been defined to a greater level. Yeah, and this brings me to a conclusion. Thanks so much. If there are questions, let's
regarding to the remedial unit as a compensation over non-compliant vessels, would you mind to clarify who is going to be charged, the importer or the owner of the vessel?
No, so the regulation is the same as the one in the EU ETS. Sorry, can you hear me anyway? Yeah, okay. And so it's the entity that is responsible for compliance with, help me here, I don't remember the name of the code. The name of the code. Anyway, I can look it up and give you the answer, but it's the same as under the EU ETS, basically, yeah.
Sorry, can you say again?
Is the entity that is responsible for compliance with the... Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, please.
So is the one responsible for MARPOL? So is the vessel owner or the vessel operator? So mainly is the responsible for the crew and for the fueling.
Yeah, it's, yeah. I can look it up and give it, yeah. It's...
And in the end, this personality that will be charged once a year.
Yeah.
After the end of the year, after the end of the year, you're going to make your balance of units, and you're going to be controlled by your administration of your flag, and then you're going to report that for IMO, and you are going to say how you're going to pay that. If the credits that you generated, or you're going to pay to exchange, or you're going to pay to IMO. But a challenge that I think is behind your question, it's how you are going to charge if you are chartering your vessel per voyage along the year. How you're going to charge your clients of the penalties generated in this voyage. If you're fueling in the client's country, that you're paying more because you don't have a green fuel. And the other voyage, you're going to have a green fuel. So for each voyage, maybe you're going to have a different emission. So how a challenge for the ship owners or the ship operators is how you're going to split this annual fee in your voyage charge. I think this is a challenge that BINCO and other association is working on.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Goran, for your very clear presentation. And I think in the same line of thinking from the two predecessors here, I would like to know something about eventually nuclear-powered propulsion applied for ships. It's not exactly very easy to talk about this, because if you are talking about IMO net zero framework focusing in 2050, maybe it's a huge challenge to say, or to quote that all the ships and all companies in the world, there's not too many companies today, and Cristiane knows very much about this. She's a very competent representative from one of them here in Brazil. But, okay, we are talking about 2050. And from the Navy, I'm from the Navy, me and Salgueirinho here, we are from the Navy, and our challenge here as a nuclear regulator organ here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, is to harmonize what is going on from IMO net zero and all the initiatives that are in course today. And in Brazil we don't have many, but we are looking forward in the world. And nuclear propulsion is one of these proposals. And once again, it's not that easy, not only because of the cost effective, but as well as, and that's the main concern that I would like to know from you, the legal framework regarding nuclear-powered ships. We know from history we had 3 initiatives between 1960, 1975, 3 merchant ships like that, not like that exactly, but 3 cargo ships, nuclear-powered. And the first concern, and we had this concern in Brazil as well, we are not free from that, is the legal framework. Okay, we are trying to say, you are not allowed to come to my port, because here we do not accept nuclear-powered ships. And that's not one of individual initiative, because there's a very hard legal framework that does not allow the ships, for example, leaving any Russian ports and coming to Brazilian ports, and as well as European ports. So what do you think, and how is your expectation regarding the legal framework? Because our boss used to say, we have a Boeing 777, the Boeing leaves the Rio de Janeiro airport and is able to land in any airports in the world, and there's no concern about this. And this is not true for nuclear-powered ships. If we have a framework, a very tough framework, we are talking about 2050. It's tomorrow. So what's your expectation specifically to nuclear-powered ships regarding harmonization of legal framework for these companies that are trying hard to IMO net zero and are looking forward nuclear propulsion?
All right, thanks a lot for the question. It's actually a great question. I don't work specifically on legal framework for nuclear vessels when it comes to safety entering to ports and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to give you a clear trajectory of what this is likely to go. But my sense is one of those topics that receives little attention within the IMO. I'm not sure why, to be honest, compared to other type of modes of propulsions. There are a lot of talks about methanol, there are a lot of talks about ammonia, someone talks about hydrogen, biofuels, of course, and so on. And everyone comes with his own problems. For some reason, the nuclear propulsion, it's just less present in the room. There are people in the room that say also advocate and say represent that sector of the industry, but it doesn't get the same level of attention for some reason. And when it comes to safety, my sense is that generally there are, and this applies also to the current fuels, there are a lot of lobbying that comes into various sides that will gain from getting those fuels into the vessels, others that perhaps would lose from that, and the safety aspect is sometimes, this is my impression, it's sometimes played as a card to say, oh look, we shouldn't do that, we should do this because there are safety concerns related to that. I think there was a similar things when it comes to LNG a few years ago, safety concerns related to LNG. I'm not fond of LNG as a fuel, and I think the same thing now applies, for instance, to ammonia, and perhaps the same thing applies also to nuclear. So yeah, that's certainly politically it's a challenge, I would say. Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure I answered the question because I don't have, but yeah.
About the fund to invest in new technologies, they are already studying, you already told. They studying, invest in new technologies in shipping, in the ship area in technologies, or in fuel, or both,
yeah.
or infrastructure?
Yeah. That's a good question. So thanks for allowing me to clarify this. It's probably both, in the sense that in the language it says you can apply, the funds can be used for, well, there is a part of the fund that goes to the reward with its Z and Z, the zero near zero technologies. These technologies are not defined, so it's not clear what is going to go into it. Likely we're going to be some fuel, but there might be other technologies that are part of it. And then in the language of the, say, the other category, if you want, there is infrastructure, so that is going to be also land-based, port infrastructure, so that's other type of technologies. But there is also, and one thing to notice is that the language there doesn't use Z and Z. It says zero and near zero technologies, alternative fuel and energies. So that somehow indicates that what is a Z and Z that is eligible for the reward might not fully overlap with the language or related to the technologies that are available to access money, for instance, through project-based funding. But what those technologies are exactly, it says explicitly energy sources, alternative fuels, and technologies, so it's probably going to be a mix of those, I would say.
Is mixed, for example, infrastructure parts mixed with the boat, and but not the fuel. Also the fuel, I think so. Yeah, it's especially alternative fuels. Yeah. So even energy sources, so it's probably wind propulsion is going to be part of that, I guess. But to what extent? Yeah. And they say now it only lists uses. It says that it has to be within the boundaries of the energy transition or shipping. What is the amount of money that's going to be left
after, for instance, the Z&Z have been paid off and the administrative costs have been paid. It's not clear. And these uses, for instance, for the alternative, so this kind of, I call them project-based. We don't know if it's going to be project-based, but so the other uses are somehow in competition with other potential use of the money, the one of the addressing disproportionate negative impacts on states. There is money that is going to go for the just transition, so that's maritime workforce related, for instance, safety, training, diversification, efforts to bring more women on board and so on. And so, how much money is going to go into that? It's to be defined, and that's why I think the governance and the way in which the money, the IMO Net Zero Fund is going to operate is going to be so important, because that's where a lot of these issues will actually come up, and the way in which the fund is operationalized will define the way in which these concerns actually are addressed, I would say.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Goran, many thanks for your speech. Many thanks for coming to Brazil. It's very positive that we have different visions on that, really positive. And even more positive to have academy studying that. So it's important to have science behind the political discussion, not to leave politicals alone without the science, at least trying to bring the best of science to the discussion. And so I thank you very much as a representative of all these studies that are being used to the discussion in IMO. And I will make one question later on. I make other, not to monopolize. But okay, then we have we achieved an important thing, that is, even with multiple visions, we could agree with majority, 80% of majority, in a regulation worldwide. And with this, shipping will be the first segment, even being small. In Brazil, it's 3% as well, and considering our internal matrix, we are 12% of the matrix, but we pollute 3%, because we are much more efficient than truck. And okay, but then we have we agreed on a fund creation, not penalizing too much the international commerce, but there will be penalization. But the studies, and Jean-David made the studies on that, how to promote the energy transition of shipping with minimal penalization, only the necessary penalization. But in the end, we have a penalization that will be promoting the energy transition, and we'll have the fund, IMO fund, that will support this as well, but a policy, a common policy to support that. And then we get to the big challenge of the fund, not the energy transition, of the fund. How we are going to consider the countries in this scenario. And you made a study in the past. I would how to split that, because if you consider you split per flag, you have today the flags, they don't represent the countries. They represent themselves. What I mean, the Brazilian flag does not represent the Brazilian commerce, trade. In the other hand, if you split by exporters, it's one thing. If you split by importers, is another thing. Would you have today a vision after all this discussion? Do you have time? Did you have time to update a vision on ideas on how to make a fair? Because your paper, if I remember well, if I didn't forget, considered that this amount could be split by country, something like this.
By group of countries.
By group of, yes. And then you will give this amount for local projects, okay? For the projects related to this. But would you have a vision today about how to, what is country in this criteria? Is flags, export, import, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great and complicated question to answer. Appreciate the opportunity to elaborate on that. Now, I think that there are first a few questions to be answered that before getting to the specific country level, if you want. The first one is the main one, is probably who can access the money. Is it only MARPOL and 6 countries, or everyone? And now that's not defined in the IMO Net Zero framework, but if you read MARPOL, there is a provision saying that countries that are not part of MARPOL cannot benefit from MARPOL. And if you extend that language to the proceeds of the that will be collected to the IMO Net Zero Fund, then it's an indication that the only countries that are part of MARPOL and 6 will be able to access the money. And so that's it's what is, I don't remember the exact number, it's like 109 out of the 176 that are part of the IMO. So that's the first probably step to be decided, and already that's a big cutoff. You could cut off almost half of the countries through that way. Which poses concerns in terms of addressing impacts and so on and so forth. And it's not, and something that I think is important to consider there is that some countries, it's not that they are not part of MARPOL and 6 because they don't want to be part of MARPOL and 6. Sometimes there is a political willingness to do so, but it's difficult to actually do the internal procedure in the country to access the MARPOL and 6. And so there are somehow constraints in that respect. But leaving aside that aspect, once that is considered and is decided, however it is decided, my view would be, without, say, having necessary, if you remember the framework we proposed was pretty broad. So we distinguished, if you want, 3 categories of countries: small and developing states, least developed countries, developing countries, and everyone. And we differentiated the possibility to access the money for different projects. For instance, the developed countries could only do it without concessionality, so at normal standard rates, and only for shipping decarbonization. The developing countries will have more, favorable type of financing terms in terms of rates, grants, or so on. And they could use it. If they could not use it for shipping decarbonization, there would be the option also to use it beyond shipping. And then you will have SIDS and LDCs that could have the best, say, access terms in terms of rate applied and so on, but they could use it also for adaptation or mitigation. Now, that is now outside the box because it's within the boundaries of the energy transition of shipping. That categorization, I have to say, is perhaps not perfect in the sense that we use the categories that the IMO uses. It's SIDS and because the IMO always have SIDS and LDCs together, developing countries and developed countries. So these are the 3 categories. So we use that categorization because it felt for us it was the easiest to accept by the member states because that's the language that they use. If you want to be a bit more, say, sophisticated, you could use different index that can be used to say, okay, these countries meet certain profile and they could use access money for this or that or that. One concern that exists is that if you allow countries with very different level of capacity to access money because they have different, say, capacities domestically, and you narrow down the possibility to access the money for shipping decarbonization, you may see a concentration of the funds into few countries, unless you put a cap on that. To give the classical example is China. China is a huge maritime sector, a lot of capacity. If you don't cap the possibility for a country to apply for projects, and you just say whatever project meets this criteria, a country like China is able to absorb a huge amount of that money compared to what is the fund. So one thing that we propose also in that framework, and that perhaps say still applies in some way, would be to use either a cap per country, and there are UNFCCC funds that do that. They say, for instance, every country, well, they say in the UNFCCC, because they have this funding cycle, so they can say per funding cycle you can access, I don't know, up to $20 million, which is a small amount. Say it could be 100, whatever it is. But say you put a cap per country. Another thing that you could do is instead use a floor. And so you say every country has a facilitated access to up to this amount, and then the rest is up for competition. And the facilitated access to that amount could be, again, $20 million US dollars, whatever it is. And say each country is somehow guaranteed that they get this money for their uses, and then the others compete for the others. So there are different ways to avoid that those that are best positioned to access the fund actually absorb all the money. And so that's probably something that could be considered in the development of the fund. Did I answer the question? Half. Okay, what am I missing?
Yeah, there are the groups of the countries, but I understood, maybe I forgot, that you should have how can you appropriate that per country? Which is a country? Is the flags country? Is the GDP, the country GDP? How can you consider a country? How you, in the shipping, how you recognize the parcel of a country in the context? Even to make a cap, if you're doing a cap, you are considering a reference, okay?
Yes.
So how you consider this reference is based on country's GDP or based on country's flag or based on, so how do you calculate the size of a country?
Okay. Well, I would say whether it's only MARPOL Annex 6 of every country part of the IMO, that's a country, right? Now, you could have a cap that is differentiated per country characteristics. Is that what you're suggesting, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well,
what is the
I have
country?
to say that's a good point. It's something that in UNFCCC doesn't exist. The cap is the cap for everyone, and the floor is the floor for everyone. There could be an argument to say, look, we differentiate the cap per, for instance, a country with 1 billion people should have a cap that is larger than a country with, I don't know, 10 million people. Could make sense. But so that's probably up for discussion. And I know there are all these criteria that have been used for the CIA, to determine the use of revenues or population size, vulnerability, and so on. Yeah. So that's something that perhaps if it's decided that there will be caps and floors, that's something that perhaps could go into the discussion. I think it's a good point. Besides that, some of these criteria, because I think you need to one thing to distinguish is the eligibility per cap and floor, if you want. But then there is also the question of the criteria used to select the projects. Because the criteria used to select the projects, some of the current funds, they have very schematic type of approaches. Others are a bit more fluffy. They give you some principle, and then it's the board that decides. And some of these criteria, for instance, climate vulnerability and so on and so on, effectiveness of the spending, it's something that could be accounted also there, not only the design of the cap, but also there, or only one of the two. It's a political discussion at the end of the day. But I think there are different elements of the governance and the management of a fund where some of these concerns can enter into and could be kind of, which kind of operationalizes the equitable transition of shipping, if you want. Did I answer the other half? Yes, okay, good, thank you.
Any other question?
There is no question. I will make a second question. Sorry. Sorry, last question. Yeah, you mentioned the coexistence of different policies as a vision, one alternative, one scenario. I would like to this is something new for me, the coexistence. Because if you coexist European present regulation with IMO regulation, maybe this will weaken IMO regulation, and maybe it will foster new side regulations to coexist as well. And in the end, every bilateral trade can have a bilateral agreement to coexist and to substitute IMO. For example, as my colleague said about the nuclear, maybe two countries can have a nuclear trade, a nuclear agreement that vessels in that trade can use nuclear. Another can have a parallel agreement, and maybe Mercosur can have a parallel agreement as well. And in the end, many countries can have a parallel agreement to coexist and maybe substitute IMO. Do you see a scenario like this as a coexistence of policies? How do you see this? This is really new for me, so anything is good that you can analyze. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And I think this is one of the big questions that now, from a policy perspective. My sense is that now the UK has extended its own ETS to domestic shipping, and there is pressure for them to extend it also to international shipping. So that could be an additional, whether that is going to happen, it's unclear, but that's an option. Before there was a change in the administration in the US, there were a couple of proposals for shipping decarbonization policies at the US level. And so my sense was that at that point, if the IMO didn't come up with something that was acceptable for other jurisdictions, you may have seen proliferation of policies with all the concerns that come with it. Now, it's a bit, the EU, I don't know what they're going to do. But say it's in a position where somehow it's under pressure internally to keep these policies for various reasons. There is environmental concern to say 2 policies better than only 1. The EU approved for the approval of the IMO Net Zero framework, but they were not probably, they aligned at the end, but their initial position was quite different. And so internally, I think politically, they might be in a position to say, look, we voted because everyone else we were kind of pushed into it, but this was not the first choice, so we could keep it. There is the revenue side. Now the EU decides how to use the money that comes from there, and giving up that, it's a bit of an issue. Whether the EU can say, if the EU decides to keep the money, so to keep the policies in place, they could either change them a little bit so that they make them more palatable also for other countries. Now, a very small amount of the money goes outside of the EU. They could change that if you want. And say if they don't, I don't know if other countries will come up with their own policies to decarbonize shipping. That's difficult to predict, but I cannot exclude it. But I haven't heard talks about it. I don't know if you have, if you want. Those are my 2 cents, if you want. Yeah. Thank you so much.
For now, just IMO and the European regulation is in your view, or other countries are developing something too? What do you think?
Yeah, so for what I know, the UK is being now pressured to extend their ETS to international shipping. The US was doing it. I don't think they're going to do it now, but there might be a new change, political change, and that could change. Whether they were able then to pass those legislation, I don't know, because they were kind of levies, and it's not something that flies very much within the US context to have GHG levies in general. So whether that would have passed and made into legislation, even if there was no change in administration, I think it's an open question. And yeah, so as far as I know, besides the UK is probably the one that I know it's a bit at least thinking about it. Whether there are others, I wouldn't know, to be honest. Yeah.
The last question is your explanation about the risk about food, something like this. It's related because the food or the fuel more expensive, and they cannot have the food expensive. What's the relation with the food risk with the IMO?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't explain that. So the idea is, if you put a GHG policy, that is going to increase the transport cost, and they say that translates into changes in import and export opportunities, import and export prices, and the impact on food transport is probably going to be larger than for many other products, because the value of the good per weight, it's lower. And so the countries that rely on international trade for access food, these are grains primarily, as staple food, they could face some, they have some concerns related to that. There are not a lot of studies done on that. There is a new paper by Pierre Cariou, but it's a working paper. But it's available online. And I think that there will be more coming up because it's a big thing. And there is also one regulation in the IMO Net Zero framework that says that there should be, continuous kind of review over the impacts, especially on food security, so there's specific regulation on food security. And so I think that either there's going to be some institutional way in which to do it, like a CIA, but focus on food security that is repeated over time, or they will rely on studies done by external institutions. Then you could do, some policy workshop and something like that. Yeah, so this is the thing. So one thing is the way in which impacts on states from GHG policies are understood within the IMO framework is primarily about the impact on transport. There is the fuel security issue related to the production of biofuels, which is mentioned in, for instance, the submission of WMU when they did the study that was submitted to the IMO. But it remains very much in the background. But the regulations doesn't define itself what the impact is and what food security is. So it's possible that concerns become more visible within the negotiation. That's a possibility. But it's the magic of vague language in regulations that allows for changes over time. Thank you.
Any other question? I will make a question for you, Goran. You know that in IMO, one of the principles is to be fuel and technology agnostic.
Yeah.
And now we are introducing the Z&Z incentive. How to keep this principle with this new concept?
Yeah.
Even considering eventually nuclear, which has high costs, hydrogen, really high costs, and so on. So what is your view on that? Because also the prices are variable in the future.
Yeah.
So how we can try to keep this concept with the Z&Z?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that because it's very complicated. And also this idea of, let's say, agnostic. It's there, the principle, but the regulation, as you know, there are actually parameters that are set of what could be considered Z and Z. So that is already not, it's agnostic within those boundaries, if you want. And one aspect that it's probably to consider, so an additional aspect of that is that in the language it also states that it's possible for MEPC to make exceptions to those boundaries. And so somehow if you make an exception to those boundaries, the principle of being technology neutral is probably going to be more of a political decision. So some countries want to have some technology that doesn't meet a parameter to be included. And so it's going to be a struggle. Say how much this, I don't know if you have a view on that, but you probably thought about it more than I have.
Oh, I guess it's a big challenge, and I do not have answer, but it's even to model that even with a lot of uncertainties and so on, it's difficult. It's difficult. Actually, what we did is just abating a certain percentage of the price of each of the technologies. So 50%, 70%, and so on, to keep the agnostic as much as possible, of course, within the boundaries.
Yeah, because the boundaries were quite political. I mean, as you know, the part of the negotiation, which should be 16, 17. Anyway, yeah. So a challenge, certainly. Yeah.
Any other questions? I guess that no. So I would like to thank you so much, Goran, for your speech.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure.
Maybe we can make a picture if you want. And okay, thanks.
But you should be back.